everyone, so welcome back to class. We are finally going to finish up on chapter 5 today, and we don't have too much further to go, so it's going to be a relatively short lecture, which is good news for everybody. And we're going to kind of pull it all together so you can see why the stuff we've been learning is useful so far. So we've been talking about elasticity, and the general idea of elasticity is we want to measure how responsive either supply or demand is, the quantity supplied or demand is, to a change in some other good. So far we've exclusively been looking at how quantity demanded is affected. So today we're going to finish it out the story and look at how quantity supplied is affected. So what we're going to start with is the price elasticity of supply. Okay, just based on kind of the pattern of words, you should be able to detect what this is going to measure. So if we're looking at price elasticity of supply, then again we're going to be thinking about how much change we get in the quantity supplied. And if it's the price elasticity, then the initial thing that's going to be shocked is going to be the price. So the idea is if the price of a good changes, then how much response will we get in terms of change in the quantity supplied. Okay, so I'm going to write this out so you have the official definition in your notes. So the definition of price elasticity of supply is how much the quantity supplied of a good. Let me switch markers. I keep picking up bad ones. So how much the quantity supplied of a good changes in response to a price change. And we're thinking specifically about a price change of the same good. So the idea is if the price of widgets changes, then how much does the quantity supplied of widgets change? So it's all anchored to a particular market. Okay. So the idea here, it's a little bit harder to kind of think about when we're doing this on the supply side, but the idea is suppose I'm a factory owner and I'm supplying nuts and bolts. So my factory churns out nuts and bolts. The idea is if the price of each bolt increases from like $1 to $2, then how much am I going to like change the speed at which my machines work, or how many machines I have in the factory? And so that's going to be tied up into the price elasticity of supply. Okay, so we're going to have a similar strategy for quantifying this. What we're going to do is we're going to compare two numbers in the same way that we did when we were thinking about the price elasticity of demand. And what we're going to compare now is the percent change in the quantity supplied relative to the percent change in the price. Okay, so the same kind of theory is going to hold. So the idea is if you change the price of a good by a particular amount and you get a relatively larger percent change in the quantity supplied, then we're going to have an elastic supply. And alternatively, if you change the price of a good by a given percent and you get a relatively smaller percent change in the quantity supplied, then you're going to have an inelastic supply. So the way we're going to kind of be able to peg the numbers to a particular label is by looking at the ratio of these two things and then comparing that ratio to 1. So case number 1 is, again, that the percent change in the quantity supplied might exceed the percent change in the price. So if what is true, this will be like case 1. So if what is true is that the percent change in the quantity supplied is greater than the percent change in the price, then if you take these two things and you stack them on top of each other, then the percent change in the quantity supplied over the percent change in the price is going to have to be larger than 1. And we're going to call this an elastic supply. So again, elastic is descriptive. It indicates that we have kind of like some stretchiness. So you change the price by a little bit, you get relatively larger kind of stretches in the quantity supplied. Okay, case number 2 is you might get these two numbers and you might find that the percent change in the quantity supplied is less than the percent change in the price. If that's the case, then when you stack these two things on top of each other, so you stack on the top part the percent change in the quantity supplied and then the denominator the percent change in the price, well, if the denominator is bigger than the numerator, then the whole ratio is going to be less than 1. If this is true, then we're going to have an inelastic supply. Okay, note that unlike the price elasticity of demand, we are not taking absolute values around the ratio. And this should be intuitive why this is the case. The reason it's the case is because if you think to what the slope of demand curve is relative to the slope of the supply curve, well, when we're thinking about price elasticity of demand, we're measuring how much a price change influenced quantity demanded change. And here we're thinking about how much a price change influences a quantity supplied change. Well, in the demand world, because the demand is downward sloping, the change in the price and the change in the quantity demanded are always going to have to move in opposite directions. So the ratio is always going to be negative. We don't care about the negative, we just care about the relative magnitude. So we put an absolute value around it when we're thinking about price elasticity of demand. Whereas in the case of price elasticity of supply, anytime the price changes by a given direction, the quantity is going to change in the same direction. So if price goes up, quantity is going to go up. If price goes down, quantity is going to go down. And so the whole ratio is just naturally going to be positive, so we don't need to take an absolute value when we're thinking about price elasticity of supply. Okay, in terms of actually cranking out a number, the equation, so I'm going to call this epsilon subscript S, so elasticity of supply, is going to be equal to the second quantity supplied minus the first quantity supplied over the first quantity supplied over the second price minus the first price divided by the first price. Okay, note this is identical to the equation we were using when we were calculating price elasticity of demand. So you might ask yourself, well, why do we have two distinct things? The reason we have two distinct things is because in the case of price elasticity of supply, these quantities are going to denote the number of units that are supplied, whereas if we're thinking about elasticity of demand, then these quantities would index the number of units that are demanded. So the structure of the overall elasticity equation is identical. It's just whether or not we're thinking about quantities that are demanded or quantities that are supplied. And obviously now we're thinking about quantities that are supplied. Okay, so far this is all nice and easy. So just to kind of reiterate this, so similar to the case of price elasticity of demand, the ratio that you calculate, if the whole ratio is above 1, we've got an elastic supply. If the ratio is less than 1, we have an inelastic supply, which is the same as the demand side. What differs, again, is when you kind of calculate the elasticity, you're going to put the absolute value around the ratio when you're thinking about demand. You're not going to do it for supply. And then kind of the final stack up is we can think about kind of the extreme cases when we're considering price elasticity of supply. So what we're thinking about here is in the demand world, we had a perfectly inelastic demand, we had a perfectly inelastic demand, we had a unit elastic demand. We're going to have a similar thing that's going on the supply side. So what we already know, so I'll just kind of start with, so we'll start with a perfectly elastic supply. Okay, if you have a supply that's perfectly elastic, that means it's like it can't get any, the quantity supply can't get any more responsive to the price change. So if that's the case, then the supply curve will just be a horizontal line. This was the same thing we had going on for the demand curve. And if that's the case, then the slope of the supply curve is going to be 0, but the elasticity of supply, so this is like the ratio, it is going to be equal to infinity. And again, this should be intuitive because what this is a percent change in quantity supplied over percent change in price. So if like we're at the end of the spectrum where you can't get any more responsive to a price change, then if you just like barely change the price, so the percent change kind of like it's so small that it approaches 0, you're going to get these enormous changes in the quantity supplied. So the numerator is going to like get bigger and bigger and bigger while the denominator gets smaller and smaller. And then at the extreme, it just kind of blows up to infinity. Okay, at the other end of this spectrum, you could have a perfectly inelastic supply. And this would just mean that suppliers are not responsive at all to changes in the price. So what this would look like is a vertical supply curve. So the idea is you can move the price up and down all day long, and suppliers are still going to supply X units. Like they don't budge from this quantity no matter what the price is. So what we're going to get over here is that the slope of the supply curve, in this case, is going to be infinity, whereas the elasticity of supply, or the number that we get from the ratio, is going to be equal to 0. And again, this should make sense because what this elasticity of supply is the percent change in the quantity supplied over percent change in the price. So if people aren't at all responsive to price changes, then you could have the denominator be like millions and millions of percent, but how much is the quantity changing? It's not changing at all, so the numerator will perpetually be 0, and so overall the whole ratio is going to be equal to 0. Okay, in the middle of the spectrum, so these are the extreme cases. In the middle of the spectrum, again, if you have an elastic supply, then what that's going to look like is a supply curve that's kind of flat-ish. So the idea here is that if you raise the price by a little bit, you get pretty big increases in the quantity supplied. And so the slope is going to be flat-ish. And the elasticity of supply is going to be greater than 1. Okay, again, in the middle of the spectrum, you could have an inelastic supply. An inelastic supply would be a supply curve that's relatively steep. So when you plot price against quantity, the supply curve is going to have an upward slope, but it's going to be a very steep slope. The idea here is that people aren't super responsive to price changes. So you can move the price up by quite a bit, and you just get barely any increase in the quantity supply. So the slope of this type of supply curve is going to be steep, and the overall elasticity number that you get using the equation is going to be less than 1. And then the last option is you could have a unit elastic supply. And that would be this case where the elasticity of supply, when you use the ratios, exactly equal to 1. So the idea is no matter what percent change in price there is, there's going to be an exactly proportional change in the percent change in the quantity supply. So in other words, in the unit elastic world, the numerator and denominator would be exactly of the same magnitude. Okay, so far this is a lot of repeat. So what I'm going to do to kind of round out this chapter is give you an example of how elasticities impact public policy making. So specifically, we're going to look at illegal drug markets, and we're going to think about how different government policies might be effective or might be ineffective given the elasticity of supply and demand in the illegal drug market. So this is important application. Okay, so I'm just gonna write it all out. So the application is, let's consider whether drug interdiction increases or decreases drug-related crime. So what is interdiction? It's a military term for like delaying or destroying some kind of enemy. So if we're thinking about drug interdiction, we're thinking about does some kind of effort to like destroy the illegal drug market work, or what does it do? So the question we're thinking about is, does drug interdiction, like English class on top of econ class today, increase or decrease drug-related crime? Okay, so what we're going to do basically is we're going to think of different interdiction tactics. So the idea is if you want to go to war against drugs, there's different ways you can do it. There's different ways you can go to war. And so we're going to consider two different tactics. There are two tactics that a government might realistically kind of employ. But as we're going to note, they're going to have very different kind of repercussions based on the structure of this market and the elasticities are at play. So tactic number one that we're going to kind of put to the test. Tactic one is what would happen if the government increased the number of federal agents that were devoted to the war on drugs. So again, this is a realistic policy intervention. So president or some kind of government official might say, we want to go to war against drugs. How are we going to do that? We're going to just hire a whole bunch of federal agents. And then let's think about like what would we predict to happen. And what's cool about this is the tools of economics can actually help us like predict how this kind of policy intervention would play out. So the tactic, again, is that the government increases the number of federal agents devoted to the war on drugs. Okay, so where do we start? So the place we start is we're going to think about the market for illegal drugs. So when we have our price and quantity plane, what we're going to be thinking about is the graph that goes with the illegal drug market. Okay, so the first thing we're going to need to do is we're going to need to think about, would this tactic impact the supply side or the demand side? And then after we decide kind of which side of the market is impacted by this particular tactic, we can think about whether that would result in an increase or a decrease in the curve that we've determined, so the supply curve or the demand curve. And then after we've done that, we can kind of think about how everything would change in terms of the prices, the quantities, and total revenue for drug dealers. Okay, so first thing. Question number one, so what would you expect in terms of the side of the market that would be impacted by an increase in the number of federal agents devoted to the war on drugs? Well, federal agents often go after drug suppliers. So if there are more federal agents on the street picking up drug suppliers and throwing them in prison, then this would kind of cause drug suppliers to either one, fix their behavior and kind of quit selling drugs, or two, if the federal agents are good at their job and they actually arrest a whole bunch of drug dealers, then either way we're going to get less drug dealers on the street. So this is going to impact the supply of illegal drugs. So we have the supply curve, so that's number one. We know the supply is going to be impacted. And then the second question is, well, is the supply going to increase or decrease? This would cause a decrease in the supply. Okay, recall that decreases in both supply and demand correspond with a leftward shift. So we would get a new supply curve that's out here at S prime. Okay, the second thing we can think about is what about the demand side? So let's think about the market for illegal drugs, and let's think about demanders of illegal drugs. they're going to have a very specific elasticity or price elasticity of demand. And what's important to note here is that on the demand side, in the illegal drug market, the price elasticity is incredibly inelastic. And the reason for that is obvious, because if you're taking drugs, drugs are addictive. So if the price goes up by a lot, you don't really say, you know what, I see the drugs are kind of expensive today, I'll be clean today. It doesn't work that way. So in the drug market, the prices can go up by quite a lot, and you're not going to get like a huge reduction in drug use. And so what we should note is that the demand for illegal drugs is going to be inelastic. Recall that if price elasticity of demand is inelastic, that means people aren't responsive to price changes, so the whole demand curve is going to be relatively steep. So when we impose the demand curve in here, we're going to draw a demand curve that's not straight up and down, but it's pretty close to up and down, like it's going to be steep. Okay, what we have here, if you haven't noticed, is a ton of information about what's going to happen to the market. So first thing we can note is we can note what happens to the price, or what will happen to the price of illegal drugs if the feds come in and hire a whole bunch of agents. Well, what's going to happen is we started at this crosshair where we had this many illegal drugs being exchanged, and here was the price per 1 unit of illegal drugs. After the federal agents came in and really decided to crack down on drugs, the supply shifted back. The demand is pretty steep, and so we moved up to this new crosshair. So this is going to result in a new quantity demanded, or quantity exchanged of illegal drugs. So we're going to move from Q1 to Q2. And at the new crosshairs, the price for illegal drugs is going to be markedly higher than it originally was. So first thing is that prices for illegal drugs are going to actually spike, like a lot. So here the price of illegal drugs was originally P1, now it's going up to P2. And this is a pretty dramatic increase because of the steepness of the demand curve. Okay, so this is the first thing that a policymaker should expect to occur as a result of their intervention. The second thing is we can think about the equilibrium quantity of illegal drugs that will be exchanged in the market. Okay, so what will happen now is this tactic will cause a reduction in the number of drugs on the streets that are being exchanged, so the quantity of illegal drugs will go down. But just note that because of the steepness of the demand curve, it's not going to go down by a ton. And the reason for that, again, is because the demand is inelastic. So even if they take the dealers off the street and the prices like skyrocket, well, the drug users still want the drugs. And so, yeah, the price will be a little bit of a deterrent, but it's not going to be a huge deterrent. And so the quantity of drugs in the market is going to go down by just a little bit. Okay, here's the last thing that I want you to think about. What about drug sellers' total revenue? Okay, here's where things get interesting. Recall that total revenue equals price times quantity. So originally, this was the price, this was the quantity. And so originally, this box right here is going to have an area that corresponds to the original total revenue from selling drugs that the drug sellers are going to accrue before the government kind of takes a step into this market. Okay, after the government hires the additional federal agents, they go on the street, they crack down on suppliers, the supply shifts back. Well, we move to this new crosshair. This new crosshair gives us a new price and a new quantity. So price and quantity determine total revenue. So price times quantity is going to be total revenue. So this new green box, color showing up on your screen. The new green box that's bounded by the new crosshair up in the northeast corner, that's going to be the new total revenue for the drug sellers. Okay, so drug sellers like bigger rectangles because bigger rectangles mean they're making more money. So here's where things are interesting. Under this tactic, although in theory it sounds really good, well, it kind of succeeds in that it does cause the drug market to shrink a little bit because there's fewer drugs exchanged. But the irony of this is that the green rectangle is a lot bigger than the blue rectangle. And the reason for that is because of something we talked about in a previous class, and that is that when the demand is inelastic, price increases cause total revenue to go up. And so what's going to happen in this world is that drug sellers' total revenue is going to increase following the introduction of more federal agents on the streets. So this is where policy becomes kind of tricky because you have to think about how are you going to weigh these two different forces. And on one hand, this kind of works, but again, this is actually kind of helping the drug sellers because they're making more total revenue. Because again, their customers are addicts, so the price is going up, so they're bringing in more per unit of drugs that they sell, but they're not selling that many fewer drugs. Okay, so let's consider another tactic. So the second tactic we're going to think about, flip the page, is what if the government tried to intervene by simply taking on like an educational campaign. So basically, what if they tried and they were successful in kind of convincing kids not to take drugs, and they went after this through education. So tactic number 2 is they're going to try to generate, or they're going to have policies on drug education. Okay, again, this is going to be kind of contingent on, let's think about what would happen if they did this and it worked. So I don't know if they still do like DARE programs in school, but when I was in school, we had DARE programs, and it was a huge policy initiative to convince kids not to take drugs. Okay, let's think about what would happen in the market for illegal drugs if this was the policy tactic the government took on to kind of intervene in this market for illegal drugs. Okay, so what we're going to do again is we're going to think about the market for illegal drugs. And what we have kind of already decided is that there's going to be a demand curve that's pretty steep. There's going to be some supply curve. There's going to be some original price and quantity in the market before the government steps in. And now let's think about what would happen following this. Okay, question number 1 that's relevant for us is, will this type of tactic cause a response on the demand side or the supply side? Well, this kind of policy is going to impact the demand because effectively they're appealing to potential consumers of drugs. So they're going out and saying, do not take drugs. This is a message for potential demanders of drugs. So this is going to change the demand curve, or it's going to move the demand curve. And then the second question is, will it cause the demand curve to move to the left or to the right? Well, if you're telling a whole bunch of kids do not take drugs and they listen, then in the next generation of kids, there's going to be fewer people on drugs, and so the whole demand for illegal drugs is going to shift to the left. So again, the demand curve is still steep, but it's just shifting back, and it's not going to be at D prime. Okay, what this means now is we have a new crosshair, or we have a new equilibrium in the market. So again, originally we were sitting here, and originally we had price 1 in the market, we had quantity 1 in the market, and then after the education policy started, we're moving down to this crosshair, so the price of drugs is falling in equilibrium, and the quantity of drugs is falling in equilibrium. Okay, so now let's think about the same kind of questions we asked ourselves before. The first question is, what's going to happen to the price of illegal drugs if this is what the government decides to do? Well, now the price of illegal drugs is going to fall. So on the surface, this doesn't seem like great news because it means illegal drugs are now just cheaper to get. And furthermore, I didn't draw this super to scale, but they're going to fall by quite a bit because of the steepness of the demand curve. Okay, the second thing we can think about is what would happen to the equilibrium quantity of illegal drugs. Okay, the quantity is going to fall, and same as before, it's not going to fall by a huge amount because the demand curve, it's going to fall, and I'm going to back up a little bit. And it may fall by quite a bit. I think I did tell you wrong here. I spoke before I thought. The price is going to fall, and because we're now thinking about the supply curve steepness that determines the reduction in the price decrease is, it could be big, it could be small. And now the quantity is going to decrease. The decrease in the quantity is not necessarily going to be small because we're going to be moving back. And what's relevant now is kind of the slope of the supply curve. So quantity of illegal drugs is going to fall. It might fall by a substantial amount. So it falls. That's what's important. I kind of spoke too soon about the magnitude of the fall. Okay, so we've got this going on. So prices of drugs are lower, but there's also fewer drugs that are being exchanged. So now what about the total revenue for drug sellers? Well, originally, before the educational initiative, we were sitting at this top crosshair. So this whole rectangle here was equivalent to the total revenue that drug dealers are bringing in from their drug sales. Well, the education initiative pushed the equilibrium down to the southwest. And so since both the price and the quantity fell and total revenue is a product of price and quantity, if they're both lower, then total revenue is necessarily going to fall. So this new rectangle that's sitting inside the blue rectangle is going to be the new total revenue for drug dealers, and it is necessarily smaller than it was before. So this means that this tactic, although it's intended to effectively do the same thing as the tactic of putting more federal agents on the streets, is going to have a qualitatively different outcome, and it's because of the elasticities that exist in the market. So this is where economists are incredibly helpful to government officials, because you can kind of think about policies that they put forward and they sound great, but when you really start thinking about how the markets work, the policies can kind of do different things depending on the characteristics of the particular market you're looking at. Okay, so hopefully this is a cool application for you to kind of kick around in your head. We're going to take a 10-minute break, and then after that we'll meet back for the exercise. For the exercise today, I've got two questions with two parts to it. So question number one is, if a factory owner supplies 2 widgets when the price of each widget is $1, and then, so think about chronology here, so what's coming next is that he supplies 3 widgets when the price of each widget rises to 2, then part A is what is the elasticity of supply? So you're going to need to take the equation for elasticity of supply, plug these numbers into it, and get a number for elasticity of supply. As a helpful hint, the reason I'm emphasizing the chronology is because if the first thing that happens is there's a quantity of 2, then this is Q1, and then there's a quantity of 3, then this is Q2. Accordingly, the initial price is $1, so this is P1, this is the second price, so this is P2, so a little helpful hint here. Okay, so A, calculate price elasticity of supply. Second question is, based on the number that you get for A, is the price elasticity of supply elastic or inelastic? To know this, you just need to compare your answer to A to the number 1. So if it's bigger than 1, it's elastic. If it's less than 1, it's inelastic. Okay, question number 2 is we're going to be thinking about the graph. So the question is, suppose the supply of X-rays is very elastic. Okay, I'm not giving you a particular number. Just think about what would be true about the slope of supply curve if supply is elastic, whether it be steep or not steep. And then also suppose the demand for X-rays is perfectly inelastic. So think about what the slope of the demand curve would be if demand is characterized by perfect inelasticity. Okay, so we've got a very elastic supply, a perfectly inelastic demand. And then part A is, if in this market for X-rays, the demand increases, so you take the demand curve, you shift it a particular direction, then what will this do to the equilibrium price in the market, the equilibrium quantity in the market, and the total revenue that the manufacturers of X-rays receive? And then part B is, if you have the same market that's characterized by very elastic supply and a perfectly inelastic demand, and then you take the supply and you increase it. So now you go back to baseline, but you take the supply curve and you shift it a particular direction. Then what will this do to the equilibrium price in the market, the equilibrium quantity in the market, and the total revenue in the market? Okay, before you zone out, I've got one last kind of assignment for you. So this is the last part of this chapter. So before next class, you need to go ahead and read the next chapter just so you're up to speed. The next chapter is chapter 6. So your assignment is to read chapter 6. I know I have no way of enforcing this easily, but what I'm trying to do in this class, I'm trying to keep the lectures significantly less than the class time because I know they're hard to listen to. Online lessons are hard to listen to for an extended amount of time. So I'm kind of like hitting the essentials during the lecture, but then I'm leaving it to you to kind of fill in all of the subtle details as you read the chapter. So definitely do read the chapter so that you can make sure you're like fully understanding all the nuances of everything that's going on. So good luck on the exercise, and I'll see you next class.